Here we go. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining me. I am Lydia Crafts. I'm running for the Maine House of Representatives in House District 90. For those of you who are new to the Community Coming Together series, we meet weekly on Friday afternoons at 4:30 to talk about a central community issue, something that's going on that's important to how our community functions and thrives. Just to review, District 90 includes Bristol, Damascotta, Newcastle, Bremen, Monhegan and Louds Islands, and then parts of South Bristol and Noblesboro. So we have a primary coming up July 14th. It's just a few weeks away. As many of you know, and as we've talked about here, I'm really strongly encouraging everyone to request absentee ballots if you haven't yet. I know town offices are just starting to receive those. I believe Bristol sent theirs out this week, and Damascotta should be getting theirs early next week. So look for those in the mail. Be sure you return all of your absentee ballots by 8 p.m. on July 14th. And for those of you who choose not to vote by absentee, polls will be open for in-person voting at your regular polling stations. Make sure you wear a mask. We'll still be doing social distancing. Want to keep everyone, including voters and poll workers, safe during the pandemic. So before we get started with today's series, I just want to mention a couple of opportunities everyone has to hear from the primary candidates for House District 90. We have been very privileged and lucky to be hosted by LCTV and the Lincoln County News. We filmed a candidates forum on June 9th. That's now available on LCTV's website, lctv.org. We'll also have an airing of Maine Challenge with host Chuck Ruger, which is sponsored by Lincoln County Indivisible, and that's a weekly show. It will air on LCTV this Sunday, I believe at 10, 2, and 6 p.m. You can check the listings right on LCTV's website, and that will be posted again after the showing on Sunday for continued viewing. I'd like to mention that today is Juneteenth, the Emancipation of Slavery anniversary and now holiday here in the state of Maine. I know there's been a lot of talk with the Black Lives Matter movement around racial justice and equity. I'd like to put a plug in for local residents to join our weekly protests on Monday out in front of the Second Congo Church at Veterans Memorial Park from 5 to 6. And then again on Thursdays from 4 to 6 in the same spot. If you have questions about that, you can reach out to Shar Corbett, the Reverend at the Second Congo Church, for more information. You can also follow the Facebook group, I believe, Damascotta Newcastle Anti-Racism. I think if you search by those terms, you'll find it. And let's see what else we have. We plugged the Bristol blood drive last week. It was a great success. I think we had around 40 people donate blood. So thank you to everyone who was able to do that. And special kudos to all of the students and teachers who have just finished the school year in AOS 93, wrapping up what was a very unconventional school year for kids and adults alike. And I just have a ton of praise for my own coworkers at the Bristol Consolidated School and the rest of the state and nation for sticking with it. And I hope all of the kids and students and teachers get to enjoy a little bit of a summer break. So from there, I'm going to change our view. And so we're coming together today to talk about rubbish, which might be an unexpected topic for some folks. With me today, I have, we have Michael Ewell down below and Mark Ward. Welcome both of you. And if you would just like to take a moment and introduce yourselves and sort of your background before we jump into rubbish and waste management today. We'll start with you, Michael. How's that?
Okay, Michael Ewell. I've been a resident of Walpole for about 40 years. And basically, I'm a writer by trade, and I've also taught throughout the Maine university system, teaching writing for a number of years as well.
Great, excellent. And Mark?
Yeah, I'm a resident of Bristol. We've lived here since 2004. And I work as a contract biologist, so I do sort of ecological consulting work for different entities, sometimes for the state, land trusts, variety of different sort of conservation-related biology work.
And do you travel for that, or is it mostly local?
It's mostly within Maine. Sometimes I go to other parts of the state, and I have gone to other states, but it's mostly within Maine.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you both for being here today. Michael, you and I had spoken on the phone a few weeks ago, and I had seen both of your names in your, is it weekly, bi-weekly?
Bi-weekly, pretty
Bi-weekly.
much bi-weekly.
Okay, so you collaborate on a Lincoln County News article entitled Rubbish. And I understand this started, I believe, around changes in our recycling and trash management right here in Lincoln County. Was it 2018 or was it 2 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah, so if you could just talk a little bit about how that column got started, what inspired you to get involved in this kind of citizens journalism?
Well, in the latter part of 2018, when we both used the South Bristol transfer station here on the peninsula, and Michael approached me in maybe like October of 2018 and asked if I would be interested in sort of exploring the changes in the recycling practices at our local transfer station and what was sort of behind them. So it was really Michael's inspiration to start digging into that a little bit more. And we decided that we would, whatever we learned, we would share with the public through the Lincoln County News. And so we never anticipated, I think our first thing that we did was in December of 2018. We didn't expect to be still doing that necessarily at this point in time. And really for about a year, we were simply sending in bi-weekly letters to the editor on different topics that we learned about. And then, was it, I don't know, maybe in December or January, that we sort of approached the staff and about actually doing a column, and now we've got the column. So.
Yeah, so as a citizen, as a consumer, right, I think many of us will remember going to our local transfer stations and seeing that all of a sudden the only thing we could recycle for plastics was number twos, and everything else had to go directly into the trash. So that was a significant and noticeable change just from the consumer side of things, which it sounds like you both noticed and observed. Michael, what was some of your excitement or interest in diving deeper, finding out more?
Well, it was that, that was the initial kind of shock or impulse is like all of a sudden you couldn't recycle that plastic and you wanted to know why. I'm a writer, so I'm curious about topics over a broad range of areas. And we, it was like all of a sudden we were drawing back a curtain on the waste stream that we had never even really imagined existed. In other words, what we did was what everybody did. We threw out the trash. We were also people that participated in recycling. But our involvement never went beyond taking that to the transfer station. And in drawing back this, in engaging this topic with this initial question, why isn't the plastic being accepted anymore? We just began this adventure of examining the waste stream at deeper and deeper and deeper levels. And it's been it's very, neither of us has any background in this area. We are strictly amateurs. And as Mark said, our strategy was to sort of learn what we could learn about a given aspect of this whole topic, and then write about it and share what we had learned with the readership of the Lincoln County News.
Yes, yeah. And what kind of feedback have you gotten since beginning with your letters and transitioning into your articles?
Well, we've gotten, there isn't really a feedback mechanism, but there have been letters that have appreciated our contribution, and you're asking us to participate here is a positive feedback also.
Yes, yeah, that's great.
We did. I would just add, we did a community forum last summer in August, and we actually got a really small grant from the Maine Humanities Council to put it on, and it was hosted by the Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust in their barn. And we were hoping we might get like 50 people to show up, and we had like between 80 and 100 people who came, and on a really hot night in the Darrow's barn. So that sort of told us like, wow, there's a lot of people interested in this topic, more than we thought even. So
Yes, yeah. Well, I got married in that barn, and I know what a summer night feels like there. So kudos to everyone who showed up. That's some true commitment, right? To talking about trash and recycling.
Yeah.
So I guess before we jump into sort of the pulling back that whole curtain, what was the initial answer? What did you find initially when that question of why can't we recycle? What's happened? Because I hear a lot of different theories, and some things I might venture are conspiracy theories. So what was sort of the initial evidence that you found about the change in recycling program here in the state and the country?
Well, we discovered, for example, that much of what the United States was bailing in the form of recyclable commodities, whether it was paper or plastic or other things, was being shipped on container ships to China. And that the Chinese had all of a sudden decided not to accept these commodities any longer because they were heavily contaminated. So that's one dimension of this, that's one explanation. But in a deeper sense, well, let me just say that the Chinese were perfectly, within their rights to reject these very contaminated bales of material. Contamination in this case, meaning that instead of being a bale being 100% paper, for example, or mixed paper products, you'd have other things inside that bale, like plastic film or cans or whatever else. So they, they were it seemed like perfectly reasonable decision on their part to say, we're not going to do this anymore, But what that did was that exposed a real flaw in the American waste management system. And that we, would later discover, and keep discovering, that like the rest of the public, that plastics are a real big problem in terms of getting rid of them. They don't break down in the environment, and that one of the shocking things we discovered, one of the shocking facts, is that the United States has never been able to recycle more than 8% of the plastic that we're producing in this society, according to the EPA.
Yeah, and that's a shocking number. I mean, that's a very, very small percentage of our overall plastic consumption and production. Yeah. Absolutely. And so when I think about sort of then, well, let's go to what happens to our waste right here, because like both of you are saying, I'm sure there are lots of viewers who would say, once I drop my trash off or have my trash picked up out front, who knows what happens? I know just recently there was a big change in the Hamden, what is it, Resources?
Coastal Resources of Maine facility, yeah.
Which has been in the news quite a bit over the last years with some trouble getting started. And so there's Coastal Resources, and then there's a landfill in Norridge Walk. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and so I know I bring my trash to the Nobleboro Jefferson station, which it was interesting to read in your articles that, my town just participates in that, but we don't have our own waste management plan outside of that. And then that trash gets brought to Norridge Walk, correct?
That's correct.
Okay,
Yep.
Now where does Bristol participate in the Norridge Walk landfill, or?
Yes, South Bristol also takes their municipal solid waste stuff to the landfill in Norridge Walk. But to your question, I think I'm reading into your question is like, where does stuff go? The challenge is that it's different for every transfer station. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the challenges from a statewide perspective. It sort of is it's a cornerstone of Maine that people like to have local control, and, towns and or groups of towns that are banded together using the same transfer station have made choices that they feel are advantageous to their own, financial, social, environmental concerns, depending on how they come down on those things. So even within Lincoln County, the answer to that question is complicated and different depending on where you live. So yeah, it just so happens that both Millboro Jefferson and Bristol South Bristol take our trash. Both of those transfer stations take their trash to the landfill in Norwich Walk, and both of them use the Lincoln County Recycling Center for their recyclables. So Lincoln County Recycling, which is based in Wiscasset, county-run facility, they come and pick up the recyclables from the transfer stations in our county, except for Booth Bay, which does its own thing. So, and then they pick up from towns outside of Lincoln County too. So it's complicated,
And so from Lincoln County Recycling, where do those materials go next?
Well, we've been trying to find that out now for 2 years.
Well, no, we know sort of in a general way. Yeah.
We know that Lincoln County Recycling has a contract with the Casella Waste Management Company.
Yeah.
And that Casella comes, and Lincoln County Recycling goes around to all the transfer stations that participate in that program, picks up the stuff, they bale it, they store it until they have a truckload. Casella comes in and takes the truck and in principle takes it to find end markets where this material supposedly is going to be recycled.
And so Casella is a private industry. It's not state funded, or it's a fully private.
Private.
It's one of the major waste management players in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there communities that have public recycling, or is it all private enterprise in our region?
The Eco Maine is the sort of Portland-based recycling and trash facility. They're a nonprofit that is made up of different towns that have sort of banded together to form this nonprofit entity. And then there are like I think it's like, correct me if I'm wrong here, Michael, there's like 20 sort of founding member towns based in the greater Portland area that sort of formed this thing. And then there's a bunch of other towns that use that facility for their trash and or their recyclables, depending on what they do. And but they're like, they sort of buy into it. They're not necessarily like founding members, so they contract with them.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so we are not part of that. The Casella is separate from Eco Maine, two separate recycling.
Yeah, those are two separate entities. Yes, yes. And I would say, I think in Lincoln County, Somerville is the only town that uses Eco Maine for their trash.
That's right.
Their trash goes to Eco Maine. Their recyclables are actually picked up by, they use the Tri-County transfer station in Union, and their recyclables are serviced by Lincoln County Recycling.
Okay. So in reading your article, so yeah, I think sort of the natural next step for me is this is about a market for recyclables, and Casella or Eco Maine, they're looking to sell, and this is a variable market with ups and downs. And one of the interesting things I read in one of your articles was just the challenge of it being about enterprise or it being about a public service. And that when the two get commingled, no pun intended, that there's a little bit of complication. Like, we don't just have a statewide program and system in place. It's about all of this fluctuation and variability, which then poses kind of a destabilizing nature to it when a market crashes for something, whether it's China pulling out or a certain resource changing demand or supply, that there's a lot of variability in it. Can you speak to that?
Well, if there's no market for a given commodity at a given moment in time, then it's not really the problem of the waste management system in Maine. In other words, if you can't find a place that will buy those commodities, even assuming those commodities are being recycled in the common understanding of that word, then those are commodities that are more than likely going to end up in an incinerator to make energy or in a landfill.
So this idea of
It's
recycling.
Yeah, can I just interject? Because
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
slightly more complicated than that. I mean, certainly the fluctuation in the market caused by the China decision was the most recent version of one of these major changes in the marketplace for recyclables that has sort of exposed the fragmentation of our systems in Maine, for better or worse. There are some advantages to sort of keeping local control and making sort of small scale decisions about things. There are some disadvantages associated with that too, in terms of dealing with a global marketplace for recyclables. But I would say that because of what happened in China, it sort of exposed the degree to which the United States as a country has really our investment in infrastructure around the processing of recyclable materials has languished because we've had a buyer who's been willing to pay pretty good money, frankly, for material that was of minimal quality. And so, we sort of had this what do you call it, sort of a sugar daddy or something for a while, that we were able to sort of, that became the norm. And so this disruption is suddenly like a recalibration of probably a system that was not well suited to deal with that, because we had gotten used to that other situation for so long.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And so from there, I mean, we think about plastic and we think about the end use of recycling or reuse of plastics, but then let's kind of switch gears to the consumer part, right, the production, because I know in the state of Maine recently, there's been some legislation and talk about responsibility at the beginning of the process for that cost and need for dealing with whether it's recycling or landfill, what happens to that plastic. So could one of you talk a little bit about this idea of the and I may not say this eloquently, but that producers take some responsibility, or that we demand that they own some of that responsibility for what ends up happening to the packaging that they're creating.
Well, we were on the threshold here in Maine of putting a piece of legislation before the entire body in Augusta, just before the outbreak of the pandemic and the premature suspension of the legislative session. So right now that whole process is in limbo. But basically what it says is that producers have to pay for the disposal of, and hopefully also the recycling of, the materials that they produce in the form of packaging that they bring to the market, that they use to bring their commodities, their products to the marketplace. So it's a fairly it's a very complicated process, but one of the places that we've looked at somewhat extensively, one of the places where this extended producer responsibility has been in place for a long time, is in Canada, and they've made some tremendous strides, and also in the European Union. But as Mark was saying, because we've depended on this, to use this term, the sugar daddy, to take all of our contaminated commodities, then the infrastructure to sort those materials in a way that produces less contamination doesn't, is behind. And one of the trade associations that promotes, well, anyway, that it's involved with the whole issue of plastics, estimates that it will take about $9.1 billion to bring our infrastructure up to what's necessary to improve our recycling overall of all of these commodities. I mean, the mechanisms that will sort and bale all of these separate commodities.
Okay, is that in the state or in the whole country?
The whole country.
Yeah.
If I could just sort of go back to the legislation a little
Yeah.
bit too, and just chime in. So that legislation that was proposed actually did get voted on in the Environment and Joint Standing Committee on Environment and Natural Resources in the State House the day before everything shut down, and it passed. So that legislation is pending. Should the legislature reconvene in its current form, they would have the potential to vote on that this session. Now, if they don't reconvene, it goes back to square one. It has to go back to committee, start all over again. So we'll see what happens. Obviously, that was it was unfortunate the way it sort of played out, because Maine is the first state to have gone even that far, where a bill has made it out of committee and has been proposed to do this extended producer responsibility for packaging. We do other types of product stewardship in Maine and in other states in the country for items like compact fluorescent lights, for mercury-based lights, for car batteries, different sort of hazardous material, paint. There are other things that sort of do this, but they're usually sort of smaller in scale. This is a broader sort of initiative. But like Michael was saying, if you look around the world, there are countries all over, like more than 50 countries in the world that do this extended producer responsibility, essentially hold the producers of the packaging material responsible for the costs associated with their disposal. And the idea is both that why should the municipalities, like in Maine, all of us taxpayers, we pay for the disposal of our trash and we pay for our recyclables too, to be dealt with. So why should the full extent of that responsibility fall on the people who use the materials when it could be handled, by the people who are putting out, in some cases, not very good quality material that is not easily recyclable? So incentivizing, this type of legislation would ideally incentivize producing materials that are more likely to be recyclable and sort of bolster the recycling system.
And so for folks who would argue like how this is bad for business, right? This is going to inhibit businesses from being successful. What type of a charge? How big are we talking of a cost per package at doing this? I mean, is this really inhibiting?
Well, apparently not. The figures we've seen in Quebec, for example, and also in British Columbia, is that the producers pass on less than a penny Canadian to consumers for the monies that they contribute to the system to manage these materials. So apparently, it's not something that should be that should create a kind of opposition in the business world that it has already created here in the United States. I mean, Maine is one of 10 states, for example. This will give you one example of one idea of the scope of the challenge we face in this country to bring our waste management system, into the modern world, into the modern era, is that there are only 10 states in the union that have bottle redemption bills. So just imagine when you have all of these plastic water bottles going into waterways or on the sides of roadsides or whatever. There's 40 states in the union that don't have bottle redemption bills. So what do people do with these materials? They litter, they throw them into the waterways, or most of them, of course, most people are more responsible than that, and they throw it into the garbage. It goes to the landfill or the incinerator.
And you see, I mean, we had this conversation a couple of years ago now with the NIPS, the small, right? There was a push to have a redeemable or redemption program for the small alcoholic bottles. I'm a big walker. I have 2 dogs and 2 kids, and we like to be out. And it's astonishing the amount that we see on the roadways of small alcoholic bottles. So I mean, I think, and for anyone who lived in Maine prior to the redemption laws, right, I think it naturally, you see a significant improvement in the levels of recycling when a program like that goes in. It sounds to me like there's a little bit of difficulty with the transparency of that cost. Like we pay for the cost of recycling and trash and waste as taxpayers, or we pay for it in the packaging that or
Right.
the products that we're buying. But I can see that it's a difficult, we all are accustomed to paying for our taxes. I mean, a lot of people don't like it. A lot of people will argue against that. But when the costs of a product go up without it being clearly connected to this is why, whether it's a penny on a product or whatnot, that I could see that lots of lobbyists, I'm guessing, would have a pretty big problem with that. What has been the response of, trade associations, folks who are opposed to this type of legislation? What do they argue?
I mean, that's part of it. That's one of the problems that they had with the legislation, at the public hearings and stuff that they expressed in both written testimony and spoken testimony in front of the committee. They say it's going to cost them too much. And to their credit, members of the committee really pressed them and said, well, how is it that you do this in all these other places? Like, how is what we're proposing in Maine, how would this be something that you couldn't handle if you do it in Quebec? And, and they were more sympathetic to really small Maine businesses who might sort of feel the impact. And there are exemptions that are built in for smaller businesses to deal with that in Maine for this legislation. But,
yeah, so I saw like if you did less than $1 million of business, or there were some exemptions around like child-proof bottles.
Number of employees that you have, there's a couple of different things. So, I mean, and it may, who knows what's going to happen with it, if it ends up being passed in the way that it was sort of voted out of committee, it could easily be changed or amended again. And so, but one of the things the point that I would make is that one of the real advantages from some of these studies that we've read about extended producer responsibility for packaging that really seems like a strong advantage is for municipalities, because we talked about the fluctuation of the recycling marketplace and how the challenge that poses to municipalities. So when this thing happened with China, suddenly municipalities are like, oh, well, we're going to stop recycling because it's costing us too much money now, right? So just put it, that didn't happen in Lincoln County, but in a lot of other places in Maine and other parts of the country, people said, we can't afford to do this anymore. And so a program like extended producer responsibility for packaging it seems to be the case in other places where it's been done, where it really, for the municipalities themselves, it smooths out that kind of a transition. They're not the ones who have to deal with the reality of that. So they don't have to suddenly say, oh my God, we only budgeted this amount of money. Now the cost that we're getting, we're paying for this instead of having somebody pay us for it. So from a municipality perspective, and therefore from a taxpayer's perspective, it would really be in a much more efficient way for the municipalities to deal with their sort of budgeted costs and knowing how much they should plan to spend to deal with trash and recycling both.
So in thinking about that, if that legislation now or in the future moved forward, which it sounds somewhat promising, would our system be complicated for how that money is dispersed in a state without a centralized, right? Like how, and maybe that's getting a little bit too far off, but I'm just thinking like, how do we decide how municipalities get that funding to support each of their transfer stations?
Yeah, do you want to handle that, Michael, or you want to? Yeah, I mean, it
No,
is.
we'll put a pass on that if that's for our next
No,
conversation.
it's in the legislation as to how they're going to do it in a general way, but it is basically sort of grouping together municipalities of similar size and criteria. So it's and the idea is again to sort of smooth out what's happening for every town, so that it isn't like every little piece of trash needs to be monitored and audited but there still is, it would actually increase our ability to track where materials are going on a statewide level much better than we're able to do now if we had something like this in place, because towns would have to sort of account for the amount of material that they were producing or sending to their recycling center in this capacity. So yeah, they would be like towns of a similar population size or sort of rural demographic versus more urban or suburban towns would be sort of lumped together, and they would be reimbursed in similar ways, like sort of grouped together and then split that part of the pie accordingly amongst them. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
that does. It does
Yeah.
it makes me just quickly wonder, is supporting recycling somewhat based on a municipality's tax base and their budgeting, where, I mean, are there areas in our state, I don't know if you can answer this, where, I mean, we happen to live in a community with a pretty strong tax base. Working in the public schools down in Bristol, like, we are afforded a lot of resources that I know, having worked in other school districts, that it does not match. And that's one of my arguments in running for office, is that I don't think that that's how public education should be funded, right? That one school district has more resources and offers a different type of education based on their funding model. Is that at all in play in how much or to what degree a municipality is able to recycle, if it's costing that town, if it's a financial burden?
It is. I mean, I think towns make decisions about what they do with their recyclables based on that. Different towns have different priorities. Sometimes it's more maybe their constituents in that town say, no, we're willing to pay for this. Even if it costs us more money, we want to do this. We don't want to stop doing this. Other towns, maybe that advocacy is less strong. And so for them, it's like, well, if we can sort of cover our costs by the materials that we're able to sell in the marketplace, or largely cover those costs, or make money if they are able to do that, then then that's sort of the decision making criterion for them primarily. So
Yeah, which I would just say, as a potential representative, I don't think that's in our state's best interest. I mean, thinking about environmental justice, right? That we not be making those decisions based on a commodity exchange, rather that our municipality, it shouldn't depend on whether or not your town can and is able to prioritize funding recycling programs, and that would just be some of my own values or personal sense of what's right.
That's good. You're the candidate, so that's I mean, you should talk about what what you think, because I mean, I think it's depending. There are different models for doing this packaging type of extended producer responsibility that we're still learning about, frankly. But there are models that give more authority to the individual municipalities to sort of make the decisions. And I think the model that's been proposed in Maine is largely that type of model. There are other models that are more, basically everybody has to do stuff this way in the province or in the state or whatever. And we don't really know why that type of model wasn't proposed here, but I mean, we can sort of guess that it's like, well, Mainers like to sort of do things their own way in different communities. And so I think that they went for the less big step forward in going for a model that is really allows the local municipalities to essentially sort of do what they've been doing. They don't have to change the systems that they're using unless they want to sort of fit in and get reimbursed for their costs under this extended producer responsibility for packaging.
Yeah, that's great. I think you spoke to, I mean, I see that a lot, whether it's in waste management or education, and kind of that centralization, that there is some cultural significance to having some decision making and some autonomy. And I respect that, because for one community to determine what another community's priorities are is difficult. But I do also think there are some trends and some there's a road or a path, and that as a state, it's also important that we focus on some of those priorities. And as I've talked about in my campaigning, our natural resources and economic landscape that's a result of those resources facing climate change is it's a dangerous cliff we're on. And I think we need to be, I think it's a balance, right? I would say I hear that. I hear the need for autonomy and individual decision making, and also looking at our future as a state is important. I would, if we can sort of shift, I just want to quickly touch a little bit on consumer practices, because we've talked about sort of the system, the state, some of the legislative, but I think people would also be interested in hearing a little bit about individual practices and how much of an impact we're having. And then some of the models of thinking about things differently that I know, the milkman model, right? This kind of exchange of goods. There are a couple of new businesses. Where are we at as, you know, coming out of this pandemic, having sort of shifted from single-use plastics are bad. We're looking at bans on foam and plastic. Some maybe weak evidence, I'm not sure, about, you know, you go to the grocery store and now everything's single-use plastic. Where are we coming out of this from sort of, if we think about context of this pandemic, what's next and what are some of the consumer practices that are out there that people have a choice in?
Well, you know, it's like the environmental movement doesn't speak with a single voice, right? So that there is a point of view within, say, the reuse movement, that recycling really is not the answer, that it's basically, and we could go into all kinds of detail about what the problems are with recycling. Even with extended producer responsibility, it doesn't in any way eradicate the problems with plastic, for example. So the reuse movement is looking for ways that will, basically, it is shifting the responsibility to the individual more than, say, the collective entity like the town or whatever, or the state. They're saying that you don't have to buy this single-use plastic item, container, whatever, this coffee, this takeout coffee cup. You know, you can have your own coffee cup. You can have your own coffee, you know, hot container, you know, whatever. And on a larger scale, you can, you know, you can actually have a situation where a business that depends on takeout, instead of throwing away, having single-use containers that are going to be thrown immediately away after the person finishes their meal, they can have containers that can then be brought back to the, you know, left there, for example, at the restaurant or whatever, and picked up by this a business that's going to then sanitize them and keep them in circulation. You know, so they'll take the used containers, they'll bring them to a facility where they're going to be completely sanitized, and then bring them back so that they're not, you know, there's one company we wrote about that actually works with major corporations, and we haven't looked into this more deeply, but they work with like Unilever, and their objective is to like keep some of these containers that they use, in this case for ice cream, to keep them in circulation for 100 uses. You know, the milkman model it's interesting because I'm old enough to remember the milkman. Where I grew up, we had a milkman, we had a bread man, you know, we had, you know, and they were men. They had delivery trucks, and the milkman left. You had a milk box out on your doorstep.
Yes, yeah.
Right? And the
I've
milkman,
heard about it. I can't say I remember.
you put your empty bottles in the milk box, and he came and he put the refills, you know, or the little bottle of cream or whatever it was, and so that was, you know, where those bottles went, you know. I was just a kid. I have no idea. I never even thought about it. All I knew was
I think they got cleaned and reused. I think that was what they did. Yeah.
Yeah, I was lucky to live in Sweden about 15 years ago, well, 20 years ago now, and they, you know, their Coca-Cola, right? Their soda practices, that you still bought soda in a case, in a flat, and it came in just like our old milk crates and individual glass bottles. And when you were done, you brought them back to the grocery store and those got sanitized and reused. So it's not, right? We talk about the milkman like it's, you know, not to tease, but it's in our farther past. But there are places and communities where it's not that ancient and it's still happening, that it is still part of their practices. And that to me sounds like the hardest shift is, you know, are there restaurants in our community using the, is it the recycle or the reusing the packaging? Does anyone?
Not the milkman model that I'm aware of locally, but like Michael said, I mean, that is the what he's talking about. One of these companies, Loop, where you know it's the 21st century version of the milkman, where you order your stuff online. It gets delivered to your door, and then they take the materials that you had from your last delivery with them when they go. So it's sort of the UPS version or something. You know, that's not even.
Yeah. So I'm guessing population density determines a little bit about that practice. But I mean, our local Oxbow Brewery, right? If you purchase a I'm blanking on the word, but the bottle, right? You bring it back and you a growler. Thank you. So I mean, it's there. I think I could imagine that on the small scale, and I hope that you know, Maine is sometimes a few years behind some larger national trends, but it will be interesting to hear how especially the corporations and with e-commerce, how as the public hopefully continues to demand a decrease in single-use plastics, that we see some changes coming down.
Yeah, one thing I would just sort of framing the reuse thing that we're now talking about in a way that I think Michael sort of alluded to is that, you know, there is this sort of like, you know, you think about the phrase, you know, reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Those are the first three elements of the waste management hierarchy. Like reducing your use of things in the first place is one way to prevent producing unnecessary waste. Reuse is sort of the next best good. If you can reuse an item rather than even having to recycle it, is a better way to go about it. If you can't reuse it as it is, then recycling it, turning it into a new product that can be used again a second time is also legitimate. And then further down the waste hierarchy, you have things like composting and waste to energy, generating energy from stuff before you send it to the landfill, which is the last rung on the waste hierarchy model. So these folks that are sort of really advocating for reuse are saying, yeah, we should be looking like one of the organizations which has some folks who work for it locally upstream. You know, they're talking about going upstream of the recycling component, you know, further up where you can do greater good than even looking at the recycling practices that we have in place.
Sure. And so I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that this is sort of a multi-tiered approach, right? That we can be promoting consumer practices and that there can be some consumer-driven demand for decreased plastics. I mean, I just look at like how easy it is to buy salad greens and now huge plastic containers that just end up filling a trash can. So there's that individual practice that has a net positive effect to reduce our plastics, but then legislatively, right, that our state and at the federal level, that we can also improve some of our practices along that whole pyramid or gradation of practice. So I think this is fascinating because I think some people think in one or the other, right, about individual choices. And I know folks who can live a very low impact life by making their individual choices around plastic or no plastic. And then some people who think, well, the individual consumer choices don't really matter. It's the large scale, the policy issues that we really need to focus on. And what I'm hearing from you in this conversation is that there's really a place for all of it, that it all has some significance in this waste management system.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the system that we have now is, I mean, I would say a large part of the responsibility falls on the individuals. you know, a very large part of the
As it stands right now.
Yes, as it stands right now.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, we could do well if we were able to craft wise policy that would make it easier for the consumer to sort of do the kinds of things that are better for everyone, taxpayers, you know, the environment, you know, so if we had good policy, it would make it easier for consumers to sort of make the right choices and have that be relatively convenient instead of being difficult. Right now, I mean, if you want to do some of these things, you know, you have, like, in our case, you take your recyclables to the transfer station. But if you want to try to recycle plastic film, like plastic bags and stuff like that, you have to go to the retail grocery store to take them, because they don't take them at the transfer station. So we sort of have a very fragmented hodgepodge approach that makes it, you know, for people who are very conscious about that stuff, there are a lot of ways to do things, but it's not that easy. It takes a lot of knowledge and more than probably can be expected of the average individual, frankly, you know.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I have a good example of that. I had some of those inflated plastic puffy packaging wrappers that come in boxes, and this was a few years ago. I had a very young child at the time, and I was at the transfer station, and I had a bag of them, and I was going to throw them away, and someone was like, wait, you can bring those to the grocery store and put them in the same place you put your plastic bags. And I thought to myself, like, sure, but I have 2 kids at home and I work full time, and like, great, I'll put them back in my trunk and they'll sit there for probably 8 more weeks, and then they may end up back here at the transfer station, or I might remember to put them. And that, you know, I struggle a lot with, like, the moral guilt of it. Are we saying that in order to serve our natural environment, we all carry the full responsibility of every decision we make? And I guess in that way, I would see a positive gain for our entire state to shift a little bit more towards that policy way, where it's not just about whether or not you personally have the capacity to, you know, remember to bring the right plastic to the right place at the right time. And, you know, I think there's a place for some state government without overstepping, that would have it would relieve a lot of the pressure on consumers for all of that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and frankly, I mean, recycling rates in countries that have done this extended producer responsibility for packaging have almost universally gone up. Isn't that right, Michael, from things that we've read? I mean, it seems like, you know, like some of these European Union countries, I mean, their recycling rates are like crazy, you know, 80% of material. Not so great for plastics, is always the most challenging part. But really capturing all the other stuff and more of the plastics than we're capturing here for recycling. So.
Even in the best of cases that we've examined, I think the highest rate of recovery that we've seen, at least recently, in recent reports that we've read, is something like 19% for plastic.
Yeah, plastics is hard. Yeah,
Yeah.
because, and partly that could be, people argue that's a technological thing. Like if well, it's both a economic and technological, I would say. As long as there is inexpensive fossil fuel available to produce, you know, virgin plastic, it's really difficult, even though a lot of the large corporations have made statements about, you know, increasing their use of recycled material in future packaging. You know, by such and such a date, they're going to do 50% of their stuff. You know, they've made some pretty impressive statements about things that they're doing in the future, but it's hard. They're having a hard time getting that material even in our current recycling system because of, it's just complicated, you know?
Yeah, this is fascinating. Well, I've kept you both more than a 30-minute planned conversation, but I really appreciate this. Last thoughts or anything you'd like to share for the public? What people, I mean, do you have plans to continue your articles? It seems like you followed some legislation. Will that continue to be part of your collaboration moving forward?
I'm always curious about why people don't participate. You know, I mean, here we do have such, you know, we have a flawed system in place. We have a situation where our towns cannot make decisions about what they can collect because the county makes that decision of what it's going to take from the towns, right? But still, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but I'm under the impression that the majority of people don't participate at all in these recycling, you know, in collecting their recyclables or bringing their recyclables to the transfer station. So, you know, there is still a need for education at the most basic level. I'd like to see. I think if you remember when people first started recycling, this is my impression. I can't say this is, you know, this is a fact. This is factual. But I remember when my son was in grade school at South Bristol. This is over 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. That there was a strong push among the kids to get their parents to participate in the local recycling, and that was a strong, you know, impulse. That the voice of the kids in this was convincing to their parents. You know, they were shaming their parents and saying, well, you know, Mary and Billy's parents are doing it. Why aren't you? You know?
Yeah, you know, as a child of the 80s, I still remember, I grew up in Belfast, and I remember Saturday mornings going as a family, and we used to, I don't know, it was volunteer run or something. We used to crush cans, and you know, that was a big part of you know, what was happening back then. But I do, you know, I struggle a little bit. I've lived in places, Vinyl Haven, for example, where they have a pay per bag use. And I think about human behavior, and I run a behavior program. It's all based around applied behavior analysis. And I think about, you know, if trash appears to be free and you can put anything you want and there's no negative consequence of that, why, you know, unless you have that value or you're driven to be, you have that personal or intrinsic motivation to recycle, there's nothing to hold you accountable. And so on Vinyl Haven, where you have to pay for every trash bag to dispose, I would guess, I don't have the evidence in front of me, but that recycling increases. Or some friends who were out on the Cranberry Islands and said, gosh, our trash bag was tiny at the end of a week. If we were back at home, we would have filled 2 trash bags. And here we were with a third of a trash bag because it costs money, right? That there's that sort of natural piece put in place. And I work with a lot of families and a lot of individuals who struggle and have challenges beyond what lots of us could imagine. And there is that kind of, you know, I don't want to say a guilt, but like, why is it that we live in a community that puts it all on individuals having to do that? Because I could probably list 10 really pretty legitimate reasons why people might not be recycling. But if we had a system that reinforced recycling behavior, I'm sure we would have much more recycling. And whether that's a negative, right, like a cost to it, which I'm sure communities are often resistant to, or some net benefit of why I recycle, what I get or see, whether it's in my community for a larger group or me on an individual level, what happens. I think it is a conversation, you know, there's probably a lot of psychology behind why and how people choose to or choose not to recycle.
For sure. For sure. No, I think you make some really, there's a lot of, like, we could go off on that for, you know, the pay as you throw model is its whole own thing. And then single stream versus source separated recycling that we do. But one thing that I would like to sort of close on as my own little 2 cents is that one of the things that I don't think I fully appreciated before we started this is how much of we pay for our waste basically by weight, right? The heavier it is, the more it's going to cost. You pay when you go take your stuff up to the landfill to dump it. They charge you by the weight of that material, right? You pay by the ton. So by far the heaviest part of the waste stream is like food scraps, food waste, like things that we put in, you know, your potato peels and your carrot peels or your, you know, stuff that you scrape off your plate that you put in your garbage bag. So if we could find a way to get either people to compost that locally in their own backyard, the more that ways that we could develop to divert that from the waste stream, that would be a huge savings to taxpayers, municipalities, and frankly, it's really not that difficult to do. But it takes sort of it's a behavioral change that it seems like a lot, but if you could, train people about how easy it really is to do, I think we could make some progress in sort of reducing the quantity of waste. I think it's like there was a study done in 2011 in Maine where they opened up trash and they basically discovered that household trash, like almost 30% of it is basically food waste, stuff that people throw away from their kitchen tables or whatever that they don't eat. And we could make a lot of progress on that front, and that doesn't involve the global recycling marketplace, and the forces at play in that world. So
yeah, that's a great point. I know Ethan Wager, who had Project Earth, he ran a small business similar. I mean, again, that you have to buy into, you have to individually choose to, and you receive some compost back. So if anyone's looking for a new entrepreneurial adventure, we might have an open spot in our community for some of that. I think that's important. Well, listen, I want to thank both you, Mark, and you, Michael.
For one point.
Yes, yeah, something else.
Well, just the other side of that coin, it's fairly obvious. If you weigh your trash bag with your organics and without your organics, it's very obvious that the difference is dramatic and immediately apparent. One of the problems with those plastic that you're buying your salad in, or the containers for condiments or whatever, the things that are not, that there's no pathway currently, whether it's because of the cheap fossil fuels or whether it's because there's a technological problem, I don't know, but those things don't weigh very much,
Mm-hmm.
And so you can fill that trash bag with, with those clamshell plastics, and you're still not going to really increase your weight, the volume, you increase the volume, but you don't increase the weight. And so it seems like, it makes it somewhat more invisible, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems less costly in some way, even though it lasts far longer. I do know, I would just want to say, I think Jefferson, Noblesboro, I think they accept compost now.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, they have a bin there. So if folks are interested in maybe some public education is an important part of bringing attention like this. There are lots of things we've talked about that I'm sure many in the audience did not know, as myself. I didn't know we had a landfill in Norridgewock that took our waste. So so I just want to personally thank both of you so much. I'll look forward to continuing to read your biweekly articles in the Lincoln County newspaper. Thank you for all of the work that you put into that, whether or not you get a lot of recognition or feedback about it. I know it's an important issue, and I just want to thank you both for being here today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, take care and have a great weekend.
All right, you too.
Great. So thank you for sticking around. If you made it this far, it was a great conversation. I think that we have two folks in our community among many who are doing some really good work on educating us and helping us figure out what's best on our individual lives and as a state. As a representative in our community right here in District 90, I think hearing from folks who have the expertise is vital. So when I chose to run, the way I created my platform was by reaching out to the relationships I had right here in Lincoln County to really become informed on what I needed to know. I've continued to do that with this Community Coming Together series. Today's discussion about rubbish is one example of that. If you have questions or concerns, please reach out to me. I can be contacted. My email is info@lydiacrafts.com. You can contact me via Facebook right here, or you can contact me via my website, www.lydiacrafts.com. You can also find out more about my campaign priorities on my platform. Make sure you have a way to vote on July 14th, whether that's by absentee ballot or showing up at the polls. And please follow me. I look forward to being your representative. And thanks so much for joining me this evening. Take care.